Appearing before the subcommittee today is Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and Office of Management and Budget Director Shalanda Young. We thank you for joining us today. We were looking forward to receiving testimony from the Council of Economic Advisors Chief Chair Cecilia Rouse, but wish her well. We are here today to discuss the administration's fiscal outlook, 2024 budget request, and our nation's economic outlook. This hearing has not occurred in over a decade, and it could not be more timely than in the midst of a great economic turmoil. It is, in my opinion, that the reckless spending and out-of-control regulatory expansion unleashed by President Biden and Democrats has pushed us into a recession. It has been anything but a transitory cycle. Our unsustainable trajectory is one of the greatest threats to American prosperity, security, and future generations. If we are to be guided by past performance, then I have great concern about the administration's budget. This administration and its agencies have failed to help Americans who have seen their personal savings crippled. It's not only fiscally irresponsible to continue down the path that we've been on, but it is intellectually dishonest to claim that it has been working. The annual inflation rate is 6%, and out of touch in stark contrast to the 3% assumed in the president's budget. It is disappointing that the administration did not only proposes even higher spending, but also incorporates optimistic economic assumptions. I was hoping that the fiscal 24 budget request would begin to limit federal spending, but instead it increases the public debt to 110% of GDP by 2033. I have consistently advocated for solutions to chart a responsible way forward. We must change gears and get going in the right direction to help Americans get the relief they need. The committee does not care to hear any excuses today, so we want you to focus on how we can turn this economy around with new and different policies than those that have failed us since mid-2020. I would be remiss if I did not mention something that's also on Americans' mind, the current banking crisis and how American taxpayers are on the hook for it. Whether through fees passed on by banks, Americans rely on, or taxpayer-funded backstops, I ask you today to be frank with us about the real impact. In conclusion, I will not be able to support the level of spending included in the president's budget. Our members are taking a hard look at the spending request line by line and will determine what level of funding can be appropriated that puts our fiscal house on a sustainable path. I look forward to your testimony today and working with you on these important issues. I'm also excited to welcome the participation of Chairwoman Granger at our hearing today, and I will now recognize my colleague and my friend, the ranking member from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I won't go into a long exposition of how much I disagree with some of the points just raised by my dear friend. That does not surprise him or any of my colleagues to my right, I'm sure. But I am pleased to be back on this subcommittee on which I served for 23 years prior to my becoming majority leader 20 years ago. I'm glad to be back. This subcommittee is sometimes not looked at as a sexy subcommittee with issues that galvanize people, but it deals with, as the chairman has just noted, some of the most important issues that confront our country and confront the administration and the Congress. So I'm pleased to be back here. I'm particularly pleased to be back here with my friend Steve Womack, who I believe to be one of the most responsible and hardworking and focused members of the Congress of the United States on either side of the aisle. And I am pleased to be his friend and have been his friend for a very long period of time, since he came to the Congress almost. And I'm looking forward to us working together very, very well. But we're going to have very significant differences. There is no doubt about that. I have a chart, and I'm going to do a special order, and anybody wants to see it next week, which outlines 70 some odd years plus years since 1948. And it outlines the economic progress made under Democratic administrations and under Republican administrations. And in terms of jobs created, one of the most stunning numbers, Republicans had 6 more years during those years from 48 to 22 or 49 to 22. Under Democratic presidents, 75 million jobs were created. Under Republican presidents, less than 35 million jobs were created during those years. This president's economic program has created 12 million jobs in 2 years, unprecedented. Now, part of that, of course, is because of the pandemic and the loss of hemorrhaging of jobs, clearly. But the economic program that we put in place on the rescue plan brought this economy back more quickly, frankly, than any other economy in the world. So I'm proud of what we've done, and we're going to defend what we've done. But we're going to have legitimate differences. We're going to have discussions about the level of funding. There are significant increases in many of the programs that we confront. I'm not surprised that we're going to have a robust debate on that, and we're going to discuss justifications for those increases. But from investing in American workers and families to shoring up Medicare and other vital programs, it truly is a budget, in my view, for the people. Additionally, it advances many priorities that fall under our subcommittee's jurisdiction. It includes, for example, a 5.2% cost of living adjustment for our nation's hardworking federal employees to keep pace with inflation. I might say, as an aside, almost every nation in the world has experienced inflation. Not a result of policies that we adopted, but the result of the pandemic, shortage of supplies, disruption of supply chains, all of those issues which make an impact on the economy. As someone who's long been an advocate for America's federal workforce, I will keep working tirelessly with my colleagues on the committee to ensure that these public servants receive the fair pay and benefits they've earned. I was also pleased to see President Biden request additional funding for the IRS. I know that's going to be a big item of contention. Mr. Womack and I have discussed that. We have a very, very substantially different viewpoint. And Madam Secretary, I know you're going to be speaking to that. My view is that there is nobody who wants to pay more than their fair share. None of us want to see our taxes increased. But every one of us ought to pay our fair share. That's the price of freedom. That's the price of our democracy. That's the price of our serving our people. We want to give them the highest quality customer service for American taxpayers and rein in tax evasion and fraud among those making more than $400,000 a year. Similarly, the proposed budget would strengthen the Treasury Department and other agencies overseeing our financial systems. Clearly, we've seen a very recent example of how important that oversight is. The recent turmoil surrounding Silicon Valley Bank and a handful of others reminds us of how crucial it is for the Treasury to receive the resources it needs to coordinate with the FDIC and the Federal Reserve to safeguard our economy. I might observe that no one probably in America has had more experience with those agencies than our Secretary of the Treasury. Our subcommittee must see to it that the Treasury is fully equipped to tackle these challenges quickly and effectively. The budget also includes robust funding for our election infrastructure, including the Election Assistance Commission. I'm proud to be the author of that commission. And I'm proud that a Republican president signed the bill, George Bush, that created that in the Help America Vote Act, which Bob Ney of Ohio, Republican of Ohio, was a critical partner in seeing that adopted. These HAVA programs must receive the funding they need to ensure that our elections remain secure, accurate, and accessible. Without evidence, many people have raised the question as to whether the last election was a legitimate election. Actually, the election 2 years before that. If that premise is adopted, that somehow the election may have been done incorrectly, then I would think everybody would want to support the Election Assistance Commission to give oversight to that very proposition. These provisions, like the rest of President Biden's budget, would help set our nation up for success for generations to come. In this morning's hearing on the Labor Health Committee, I talked about the expenditures, that they are investments, and investments in a stronger and better country, a stronger economy, the growth in jobs. They stand in startling contrast to proposals, frankly, we've heard recently to roll back federal appropriations to their fiscal year 2022 level. The senior member on our side may have some words to say about this. This extreme course of action would lead to a cut of at least 22% for essential programs. These cuts would also deal a severe blow to airport and railway safety. Millions would lose access to health care services provided by community health centers. These are just a few of the plethora of effects, adverse effects these cuts would have on our country. One more minute.
I'm going to yield the gentleman another minute, but I want to remind him that he does not have magic minutes in the committee like he is accustomed to in the majority. But we do need to move on.
It is such a sad truth that the chairman reminds me of. I miss the magic minute more than I miss any other perk in being majority leader. And I had that for a long period of time, so I've just become accustomed to it, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad that you'll discipline me properly. It's not fair to put that immense burden on the American people, those cuts. Instead, we must make sure that Americans have the resources, opportunities, and support they need to get ahead. I think this budget is subject to oversight, as the Appropriations Committee ought to do. We're not the agent of the administration. We're the agent of the American people, as you are. And I want to say, in closing, how proud I am. I've had the opportunity and pleasure of working with Janet Yellen for many, many years. Madam Secretary, you're a credit to our country. You're a credit to this administration. And you're a credit worldwide. Thank you very much. And then Shalanda Young, all of you know Shalanda Young. Shalanda Young is one of the great resources of this country. She was a great resource to our committee. She's now a great resource to the Biden administration. But much more than that, she is a great resource to the country. Thank you very much, Shalanda. And I hope Charlie's doing well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Time that I did not have.
The magic 8 words from Steny Hoyer. I yield back the balance of my time. I'd like now to take this time to recognize the Honorable Chairwoman of the full committee of the Appropriations Committee, Ms. Granger, for her opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman, for yielding. And I'd like to give a especially warm welcome to Shalanda Young, who I've known since she was the staff director of this committee. And Ms. Yellen, who's here and always speaks so well. So I thank you both for being here. Shalanda's a very tough negotiator, but she does. But she gets what she asks for, and she does it really well. We're here today to discuss the administration's fiscal year 2024 budget request and our nation's economic outlook. This is an extremely important topic, and I want to thank the subcommittee chair, Steve, for calling us all together. During the State of the Union address, President Biden said the economy is strong. However, I think the numbers tell a very different story. The American people are struggling to make ends meet because of high inflation. Everyday items such as gas and groceries still cost too much. I look closer at the economic situation. When I do that, there's a cause for alarm. The Congressional Budget Office recently said if current policies continue, more than $20 trillion will be added to our debt over the next 10 years. This leads me to believe that something has to change. We can't afford to continue down this path. Instead of reining in spending, the president's budget proposes that more money be spent on unnecessary programs. It's not clear to me how this plan will get the high prices and high debt we're currently experiencing under control. While I have concerns about the proposal, I think it's important to have an honest conversation about these issues so we can begin to find common ground. Secretary Yellen and Director Young, we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
We're also delighted to have the distinguished ranking member of the full Appropriations Committee, Ms. DeLauro, and you're welcome to give your opening remarks, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Mr. Chairman, and to you and to the ranking member. Thank you for hosting this important hearing. Delighted to welcome our guests today, Secretary Yellen and Director Young, both of whom I've had the honor, as many of you have, of working with over the years. And thank you, Madam Secretary. And with regard to Shalanda, worked with her when I was ranking member on Labor Age, but when I got to be the chair of a committee, she only spent a very few weeks before she was just, snatched away by the White House. But in both iterations, it's a delight and pleasure to work with you, and thank you for the great job you both do. Like the Appropriations Committee, the Office of Management and Budget and the Department of Treasury touch every corner of our nation and impact people at every stage of their lives. OMB, by preparing the budget request and then distributing funding bills after enactment. Treasury, by paying the nation's bills and collecting our revenue. You directly impact the government programs and services that our communities rely on and help us to create jobs, lower costs for families, improve public safety, support small businesses, and strengthen economic opportunity. This committee knows this well because over the past 2 years, with support from you and Democrats and Republicans in both the House and the Senate, we passed and we enacted government funding bills that reversed decades of underinvestment while lowering drug and energy costs, creating jobs, supporting our police, making our nation and our communities safer. To continue this critical work, President Biden's 2024 budget allows for vital increases in investments in the programs and services that hardworking people, small businesses, communities in need rely on. And with an increase in taxes on big corporations, President Biden is proposing a plan that rewards work, not wealth. I know that this budget blueprint would not be possible without the tireless and dedicated work of the staff in your agencies that adapt and respond to the economic challenges of the day. Secretary Yellen, I'm glad to see a request for increased funding to the Department of Treasury. I look forward to discussing how this will ensure that wealthy and large corporations pay their taxes, improve taxpayer experience, increase equity through community development, job creation, combat money laundering, helping to implement a new outbound investment review program, and support sanctions activity related to the war in Ukraine. Look forward to discussing the request and to reviewing the President's full request in the coming weeks. Secretary Yellen, I just have to say a thank you, and I'll be for all of the work, your work and the department's work on the child tax credit. We would not have been able to implement the child tax credit without the Treasury and without the IRS. You distributed $93 billion to families of approximately 61 million children around this country in 5 months. 4 million children lifted out of poverty, the largest decrease in child poverty in history, and the largest tax cut for working families in generations. I have not seen a federal program that has such a profound effect in such a short period of time and has worked in such a short period of time. I believe it is really an essential tool to fight rising costs and bring people and families to financial stability. I just have to mention that, as Mr. Hoyer mentioned, I am worried about the House Republicans' leadership, the reported proposal to cut 2024 discretionary spending back to the 2022 levels. I've received responses to most of my letters to cabinet secretaries and to senior leaders outlining the dangers posed to the American people if the cuts were enacted. The numbers are really horrifying. Cuts cause irreparable damage to communities, gut programs that every single American relies on. The proposal, in my view, are unrealistic, not sustainable, and put people at risk. So I look forward to discussing this with our witnesses today. During the weeks to come, I will continue to work with my colleagues in both chambers on both sides of the aisle to pass final funding bills. We did. We passed final funding bills. 2 years in a row, we did that with help with both sides of the aisle and with both houses. So we can't, no member, no senator, no party, no chamber can do it on its own. So thank you for being witnesses here today, for your testimony. You could not be more timely. And again, I want to say thank you to Chairman Womack and to Ranking Member Hoyer.
Thank you, Ms. DeLauro. It's time now to hear our testimony today. Let me remind both witnesses that your prepared statements will be entered into the record, and you will each be given 5 minutes to summarize your opening statements for the benefit of the committee. And with that, Madam Secretary, I invite your testimony, and you are now recognized. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Chairman Womack and Ranking Member Hoyer. Thank you for inviting me to join you today. And I'd also like to thank you for your leadership of this subcommittee and support of the Treasury Department. 2 years into this administration, Treasury continues to serve at the forefront of our nation's response to some of its most urgent challenges. We have advanced our country's domestic and international economic priorities thanks to the resources that you've provided us. Our top priority is to protect the health of the U.S. economy. 2 weeks ago, we learned of problems at 2 banks that could have had significant impacts on the broader banking system in the American economy. In the days that followed, Treasury worked with the Federal Reserve and the FDIC to take decisive and forceful actions to strengthen public confidence in the U.S. banking system. We took actions to protect all depositors at the 2 failed institutions and provide additional liquidity for banks. This was designed to mitigate risks to the banking system. It's important to be clear. Shareholders and debt holders of the failed banks are not being protected by the government, and no losses from the resolution of these banks are being borne by the taxpayer. Deposit protection is provided by the Deposit Insurance Fund, which is funded by fees on insured banks. As I've said, we have used important tools to act quickly to prevent contagion, and they are tools we could use again. The strong actions we have taken ensure that Americans' deposits are safe. Certainly, we would be prepared to take additional actions if warranted. Beyond our work on the financial system, Treasury has also led our administration's broader efforts to recover and stabilize our economy from a once-in-a-century pandemic shock. Our Office of Recovery programs help drive the fastest and most inclusive labor market recovery in history by coordinating the effective implementation of the American Rescue Plan relief. Today, the unemployment rate is near historic lows. Our economy has added over 12 million jobs since the start of 2021. Our administration is now building on that progress by effectively implementing long-term investments enacted by Congress. Internationally, Treasury continues to mount a swift, bold, and enduring response to Russia's illegal war against Ukraine. In my visit to Kyiv a month ago, Ukrainian officials told me firsthand about the critical impact of our work. As part of a broad coalition, we're responsibly dispersing vital economic assistance to Ukraine. Since last February, Treasury has also implemented over 2,500 Russian-related sanctions. We have degraded the Kremlin's ability to replace more than 9,000 pieces of heavy military equipment that it's lost on the battlefield, and we have also stabilized global energy markets and cut into the Kremlin's revenues by implementing innovative caps on the price of Russian oil. The President's fiscal year 2024 budget requests the necessary resources to continue advancing our nation's priorities. I will highlight 3 imperatives. First, the budget requests $14 billion in discretionary resources for the IRS. For too long, the IRS has been woefully underfunded. We're changing that. Our budget request provides steady state operational funding that will allow taxpayers to receive the best service possible. It will complement the one-time long-term investment in the IRS from the Inflation Reduction Act. We've already seen our investments pay off. For example, the IRS has answered 1 million more phone calls during this filing season than at this time last year, and now is the time to build on this progress. Second, our budget request shores up our capacity to respond to Russia's immoral war and advance other national security priorities. It includes $244 million for the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence to continue to administer, enforce, and modernize our sanctions regime. It also allows the office to expand financial intelligence and sanctions-related economic analysis. Further, the budget requests $229 million for FinCEN to support its efforts to address deficiencies that illicit actors exploit to evade scrutiny. Third, this request enables us to continue our work to bolster the long-term foundations of the American economy. We are requesting $332 million for Treasury's departmental offices, which craft and implement policies to advance our economic priorities and coordinate government-wide efforts to promote financial stability and growth. We're also asking for an increase for the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund, which expands credit and financial support to historically underserved communities. I want to end by thanking the men and women of the Treasury Department for their service. Their dedication and commitment inspire me every day, and I could not be prouder to call them my colleagues. With that, I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Madam Director, Ms. Shalanda Young, the time is yours.
You'll be happy to know I cut back. No need to repeat some of the things the Treasury Secretary touched on, but thank you for having me here today. I don't think you see many witnesses who are happy to come and do this, but when one returns home, it is a very happy day for me to get to come and do this, and I still pinch myself, and really because I get to sit next to Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen. So thank you for having me. President Biden came into this office with a very clear plan, and you've heard him talk about this, to grow not from the top down, but from the middle out and the bottom up. Over the past 2 years, in the face of significant challenges, that strategy has produced historic results for the American people. You heard the Secretary of Treasury talk about the strong labor market, and the president's economic plan promotes workers, has fueled a manufacturing boom, close to 800,000 jobs in manufacturing added back, and is strengthening parts of the country that have long been left behind. And this president has done all of that while being fiscally responsible. During his first 2 years in office, the deficit fell by more than $1.7 trillion, the largest decline in American history. And the Inflation Reduction Act will reduce the deficit by hundreds of billions more over the next decade. The president's 2024 budget details a blueprint to build on this progress and finish the job. It's built around 4 key values, because budgets are values: investing in the American people, lowering costs for families, protecting and strengthening Social Security and Medicare, and reducing the deficit. And it does all of this while ensuring that no one earning less than $400,000 per year will pay a penny more in new taxes. The budget more than fully pays for its investments, cutting deficits by nearly $3 trillion over the next decade by asking the wealthy and large corporations to begin to pay their fair share and cutting wasteful spending to special interests. The budget builds on the progress made over the last 2 years and proposes additional policies to lower costs for working families, including for health insurance, prescription drugs, childcare, utilities, housing, college, energy, and more. When working families have a little bit more breathing room, they can help power our economy. The president believes that Social Security and Medicare are more than just programs. They are promises we have made to generations of America's seniors. The budget keeps that promise, protecting and strengthening these programs without cutting benefits for our seniors that have paid into these programs their entire working lives. It also invests in America and working families by bolstering manufacturing, making our communities safer, providing paid leave, supporting research in cancer, delivering for our veterans, cutting taxes for families with children, and more. These investments will pay dividends for decades to come, and in what will be a decisive decade for America and the world. This budget reflects the national security strategy by including robust investments and military readiness, our diplomatic and development tools, and honors a sacred commitment to our veterans. I'd like to end by saying a few words about OMB's budget. And thank you to the members of this committee for supporting OMB in the 2023 omnibus. Those resources have allowed us to fill critical career staff vacancies, investing in our outstanding workforce and restoring OMB to its historic staffing levels, overcoming what have been the second lowest staffing level in 15 years, so thank you. And it comes at a moment when OMB continues to take on significant new areas of responsibility. To just list a few of those, we're leading the President's Made in America agenda. That office is based at OMB, implementing the bipartisan infrastructure law, transforming federal customer service delivery, and much more. So thank you for your support. Our fiscal year 24 request will allow OMB to continue rebuilding and maintaining our career staff, which is necessary for us to advance OMB's mission. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Director Young. Members are advised that you've got a timer in front of you, and if that timer is working correctly, when it gets into the yellow, that means you've got a minute left. In the case of Steny Hoyer, we're going to start in the yellow. I'm only kidding, Steny. He is my friend.
Everybody else was hoping you were accurate.
Yeah. We'll start our Q&A now with our witnesses, and I'll lead. First of all, stabilizing the national debt should be a top priority, not just this administration, but I think there is a clarion call around the country for us to do something about this unsustainable trajectory that we're on. It is my belief that the President's 24 budget falls short of the deficit reduction needed to put our country on a sustainable path. Director Young, when you testified here last year on the 23 budget, we discussed the debt and the need for solutions to address runaway spending and the national ledger. So I have a couple of questions. The first one is a pretty simple question. Do you believe that government spending contributes to inflation?
I have the Secretary of Treasury here who probably can speak to inflation better than I can, but I'll point out, and it was mentioned by Mr. Hoyer, we see inflation in most democracy or most economies across the world. So what that tells us is that coming out of the pandemic, supply chain shortages have much more to do with inflationary pressures we see across the globe.
Secretary Yellen?
So I would agree with that. We have now had 7 months in which 12-month inflation has been declining. We're seeing reduced pressures on supply chains, a dramatic decline in shipping costs, for example, that was an indicator of supply chain problems. The shifts in work, means of work during the pandemic gave rise to big increases in housing prices and rental prices. And we can see in current indicators that's now stabilizing or coming down, and that will eventually pass through into lower inflation. So it is the first job, the job of the Federal Reserve to take actions to bring inflation down. But these factors are lowering it, and the administration has taken actions to bring down healthcare costs, to bring down energy prices, and to lower the costs that burden American families.
So it is my opinion that federal spending, excessive federal spending, I know we got to spend money to finance the role of government, but excessive federal spending, in my opinion, does contribute to inflation. So the next question is, how much inflation should we endure, and at what point will it be necessary for us to roll back federal spending, irrespective of the fact that has been suggested by the ranker and by the two witnesses here today that the entire world is suffering from inflationary spirals, so it's natural that I don't necessarily subscribe to that notion that we have to be like the rest of the world. We have some unique opportunities to control it ourselves, to include the federal budgets. So at what point in time Ms. Young, does it become necessary for us to reduce federal spending?
So I'll certainly answer that. You asked a couple different ways. Should we keep our pressure on to bring down inflation? My answer to that is absolutely. We share that goal. We should understand what causes it. As the Secretary has pointed out, the Fed has tools in which to deal with inflation with regard to raising rates. This administration's also taken action through the Inflation Reduction Act. But you're right, we share your concerns that Americans are paying too much for household goods. But I'd also point out some of the investments you see here, like in childcare and housing and college, is exactly to help American families have a little more breathing room when they're trying to do their budgets. So we agree, and I understand there'll be disagreements on how to deal with that and bring that in. But my concern, if we go under the acts in some of these programs, I think about low-income heating assistance. What happens to those families if those federal programs are pulled back so far that they hurt the very people I think all of us want to help?
Thank you. I'm out of time. I'll recognize now the ranking member, Mr. Hoyer.
I'll try to stay in my time. First of all, let me observe, Mr. Chairman, nobody likes inflation. Inflation eats away, particularly at those with fixed incomes. But I've served here, as all of you know, a long time. And inflation under Ronald Reagan in his going into his third year, I believe, was 10.7. So as a comparison, but we need to bring inflation down. But I want to add something about a broader thing. Madam Secretary, if we fail to increase the national debt to allow headroom so that America can pay its bills, what impact will that have on inflation?
You're talking about the debt ceiling?
Yes.
I think it's utterly imperative that we raise the debt ceiling. That is about allowing the government to pay the bills it has already incurred. It has nothing to do with future spending. And a failure by the government to pay the bills it's incurred is something that would be economically and financially catastrophic. It would have a horrendous effect on financial markets where the United States is seen as an utterly secure country in which to invest. U.S. Treasury securities are seen as the safest bedrock of our global financial system. The U.S. dollar serves as the world's reserve currency. We would be undermining that and even coming close to the debt ceiling without raising it. We saw in 2011 that led to a downgrade of the U.S. credit rating, and this will raise borrowing costs for American households and businesses for a good long time. If we failed to raise the debt ceiling and had to cut spending to match the inflow of revenues that we had, we would be certain to have a recession or worse. It would be a dramatic cut in spending, and the financial market consequences would be disastrous. I strongly urge Congress to raise the debt ceiling, and to fail to do so would lead to economic and financial chaos.
Madam Secretary, would it be fair to say that every one of your predecessors, whether they were Republicans or Democrats, shared that view?
Absolutely.
Would it be fair to say that the last time we raised that limit, it was a bipartisan vote in which the Democrats joined with Republicans to avoid that irresponsible action?
There have been many occasions, 90 or more occasions, in which Democrats and Republicans have joined together to raise the debt ceiling, which simply allows the Treasury Department to pay the bills the government has incurred.
Madam Secretary, last question I would ask of you is, we passed an 80 billion or 87 billion increase in the Treasury, in the IRS budget in the Inflation Reduction Act. That was to get them back to a position they had been over a decade ago. while the population of our country has substantially increased and the complexity of our tax system has increased. The proposition was made that we had done so that there would be armed guards at everybody's doorstep demanding that they pay their taxes. Everybody ought to pay their fair share, but no more than their fair share. Would you comment on what we need to do with IRS? You mentioned it in your statement, but elaborate on what the consequences of cutting that increase to get them to a level where they can service the American people.
So the IRS needs both discretionary appropriations that are adequate to service a base level of spending on an ongoing basis. And that budget for ongoing expenditures has fallen by 20% in real terms just between 2011 and 2019. The staffing levels at the IRS are at 1970 levels, in spite of the fact that our GDP has risen enormously since that time, and the need for staffing has increased. The consequence of that has been a tax gap that over a decade is estimated at $6 or $7 trillion.
Those are taxes due, but not paid.
But not paid. And the money that we spend on the IRS, both discretionary and mandatory, contributes to lowering the deficit because it enables more tax collections. And importantly, it's also a question of service to the American people, of do they get the phone calls they make answered. I promised that with this additional funding, this tax season, the IRS response rate would be, in customer service, would reach 85% from a level under 20% last year. And so far, IRS is meeting that. So Americans can see, as they have contact with the IRS, that the IRS is going to be servicing their needs. And the money that was allocated for mandatory spending over the next decade will serve to modernize the IRS and transform it into a modern agency that will work with businesses, work with households, make it easy for them to pay their taxes.
Thank you, Madam
Thank you.
Secretary. My time is long expired.
Thank you. Mr. Amodei.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I also want to say that I'd like to take up something with the ranking member offline, but I was told this committee was a sexy committee, and so we'll need to straighten that out before we go much further in this
Well,
process.
I'm new to it at this range. Maybe I'll find out that differently.
We'd be happy to put you through the new charm school. Thank you, sir. Madam Secretary, can you tell me how much the IRS budget was increased in this last budget cycle?
Sorry, you mean between 22 and 23,
Yes, ma'am.
or with the request?
No, between 22 and 23, the budget you're operating now, how does it compare to the budget that you were operating with the year before, if you know generally? And you can get back to me later, but,
There was a 100 million decrease.
okay. And so can you tell me if you have an opinion on what the IRS's reputation is amongst the country? Have you done any polling or anything like that to see what generally taxpayers think, middle, wealthy people, bottom, I mean, are they kind of like the National Park Service? Are they a little different? What do you think their impression is?
Well, it's extremely negative because the IRS has been starved for resources. And so there
So
are
that's what you would-
insufficient
I don't mean to
people.
cut you off, but I've got even less time than the ranking member does. So you think it's resource-related that they have
Absolutely.
a bad reputation? It's nothing to do with historical culture in the agency or anything like that?
The
Is that your
agency
testimony?
has been resource-starved, and it's not been able to invest in the kind of technology that makes it.
Is it your testimony that you think it's because of resource starvation that the IRS has a alleged reputation amongst taxpayers in this country. Is that your testimony? Is it because they were starved of resources in order to have a better reputation?
People know that if you call the IRS, the phone isn't answered, and it's difficult to do business with the IRS, and that reflects a shortage of resources.
I'll accept that as your answer. Can you tell me the specific energy jurisdiction that is housed in the Department of Treasury under the United States Code?
I'm sorry,
Can you tell me the specific energy jurisdiction that is housed in the Department of Treasury under the United States Code?
energy jurisdiction?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm not sure I understand what that means.
Okay, well then, let's try this one. Can you tell me what the election jurisdiction is of the Department of Treasury as reflected in the United States Code? And I'm just going off the statements that were made earlier, ma'am, about, they were wide-ranging as well they could. I'm just looking for specific jurisdiction in existing statute for energy policy from the Department of Treasury, from elections policy from the Department of Treasury.
Well, with respect to energy policy, for example, our Office of Tax Policy has responsibility for writing the regulations to implement all of the clean energy tax credits that are part of the Inflation Reduction Act and earlier.
So that's, do you collaborate with anybody like the Department of Energy or anything, or is that all Treasury's bailiwick when you're writing those regulations?
We certainly collaborate with the Department of Energy and other agencies that have expertise in this area.
Okay? And I was listening, and I understand how important programs like childcare or low-income energy assistance, those are all good things. Is there any analysis that takes place? Because unfortunately, a lot of this is multitasking, and some of it, quite frankly, is value judgments. But when you talk about, we've got to continue the child care tax credit, and we've got to continue low energy, is there any analysis that takes place in terms of trying to find a sweet spot between what that costs and what is unfunded in the context of the debt?
It's okay if I take it.
Yes, ma'am.
This is where I say we have disagreements, but this president believes it's incredibly important. If we put proposals forward like the child tax credit, we should pay for those.
And I get that. I'm just saying, we don't have the luxury as the Budget Committee, not the Budget Committee formal, but the Funding Committee, to say, we're not going to make this competitive in any way, shape, or form with other federal spending, whether it be deficit spending or paid for by some revenue stream. So am I correct that the testimony is, we don't evaluate what that does in the context of the overall appropriations bill? Those things are untouchable in terms of a budget request?
So I spent 3.5 hours with our colleagues at House Budget, who look at both sides of the ledger, discretionary, mandatory revenues.
Yeah, but Shalanda, that's a B committee.
Don't make me do that. I really like
I would-
Chairman Arrington.
I
Don't do
withdraw
that
the-
to me.
I withdraw the comment.
But that is the committee, and as the former chairman of the Budget Committee sits there, we know jurisdiction in Congress are complicated, but what budget does bring to the table is we look at spending, revenue, all of those things in one place and see how our fiscal house is doing.
Thank you, and because I do not want to follow in the esteemed ranking member of the committee's footsteps, I'll yield back, even though I have no time to yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Amodei. I was about to have his words taken down about this comment about Budget Committee. Now, that's just, that was unacceptable. Who's, me? Ms. DeLauro? Ms. DeLauro, you're recognized.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Just make one quick point. Mr. Amodei's point, there was never any connection made in the past about what contributed to the deficit in terms of $1.7 trillion in a tax cut to the richest 1/10 of 1% of the people in this country and to the biggest corporations who pay no tax. With that, Director Young. Let me give us an idea of the real impacts of the cuts that are being proposed with regard to using 2022 numbers to the 2024 budget. Describe the human consequences: children, families, seniors, veterans, and millions of people across the country.
Mr. Laura, you asked the administration, you sent letters, we
got the
responded to
letters.
those, and I'll highlight a few things we
Okay.
let you know in letter form in response. We're concerned with budget cuts that would take us back, that we'd lose 11,000 FBI personnel, that we'd lose 400 local law enforcement through cutting back on state and local grants as Department of
So we
Justice.
defund the police. Go ahead.
We are concerned that 11,000 fewer rail safety inspections would happen, 30,000 fewer miles of track inspected, shutdown of 125 air traffic control towers, TSA wait times go up because fewer people, Pell Grants for 80,000 students would be eliminated, and reducing the maximum award by $1,000.
Go on
So
and on and on.
there are a lot of examples, and we highlighted many of those in response to your letters.
Thank you, and I thank you for helping me to get those responses. Have you heard either Director Young or Secretary Yellen, have my colleagues on the other side of the aisle made any similar requests for information about the impact of the cuts that they intend to try to make?
Well, I certainly don't monitor everyone who they call. If you're asking, have I entered into this dialogue, not specifically about these cuts.
So we haven't heard from the other side in terms of the implication of the cuts. Let me move to you, Secretary Yellen, because I want to try to keep to the amount of time I have, Mr. Chair. I appreciate your partnership on the outbound investment review. Pleased that you, Commerce, et cetera, requested $60 million. This is a mechanism through executive order that review and look at the outflow of U.S. capital and what effect that would have on our supply chains, our economy overall. And so it's my understanding that the executive order will look at artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and semiconductors. As you know, I want to make this stronger. I've tried to look at that we ought to include in this large capacity batteries, critical minerals, active pharmaceutical ingredients, and that's why I've introduced the National Critical Capabilities Defense Act, which I might add is bipartisan, both in the House and in the Senate. How will the potential executive order on outbound investment include or add sectors outside of those that will be originally outlined by the administration? What is your plan to expand and modify the executive order going forward?
So we're working on this order and trying to determine exactly what it should cover. We have been focused on the most sensitive technologies and sectors that are critical to our national security. We think it's important to work with other countries to make these restrictions effective, and these are areas where I think we have the greatest chance of working collaboratively with our partners. But we're certainly open to engaging with you to discuss what the right coverage is. Would look forward to conversations there. I would say around supply chain issues, there are many initiatives underway to strengthen our supply chains. That is a very important focus of the Inflation Reduction Act when it comes to batteries, clean energy, and reducing our dependence on China, for example, where many of the critical minerals. So we are taking a range of actions on those critical issues.
I would just
In
add
any
one
event.
with regard to active pharmaceutical ingredients. Let me just put it in real terms. We hit a pandemic where we found that the active pharmaceutical ingredients in drugs effort were not manufactured in the U.S., but manufactured in China or in India. We need to bring that back.
I think supply chain issues are critically important.
I thank you both very, very much for your work. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Joyce?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Yellen, I'm sure you know earlier this year, the European Union's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive went into effect. This EU law has unprecedented scope and will impose ESG-related requirements on many U.S. businesses, requiring that they gather detailed information from their suppliers, which include American small businesses. These rules go farther than even the most aggressive proposals by our own regulators. As you know, SEC Chairman Gensler's proposal would mandate disclosure of Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions from American companies. This proposal has been widely criticized for the burden that it imposes on businesses of all sizes. And as bad as the SEC's proposal is, the EU has now imposed a standard that is much more burdensome in which many American businesses are already preparing to comply with. I'm sure you can understand why this proposal is troubling to members of Congress when foreign governments put their mandates on U.S. businesses. On this matter, what is the administration doing to protect U.S. businesses from burdensome foreign regulation and prevent efforts which undermine our sovereignty?
Well, different countries are moving at different speeds and in different ways to address climate change. And we are encountering conflicts with other countries because of differences in our approaches. I think as a fundamental, we agree with the European Union that disclosure of climate-related risks is important so that investors are able to make good choices about where they invest and understand the risks in different companies. So as a general matter, we believe, as the Europeans do, in disclosure, which is behind Chair Gensler's proposal. I know he's received many comments on, but we are engaging with the European Commission to understand the implications of their proposals. We want to avoid unnecessary market fragmentation, which different approaches can produce. We want to maintain a level playing field for U.S. Companies and make sure that they're not burdened with incompatible regulatory requirements around the world. So this is an important issue that we're focused on addressing.
All right, I'll accept that. Secretary, also this administration, and you just claimed prior, that billions of dollars in additional funding provided to the IRS in 2023 for increased enforcement will somehow not be used to target individuals making less than $400,000 per year. I got to tell you, I'm a little skeptical of that claim. And, and which specific mechanisms has your department and the IRS put into place to make sure that this money is not used on burdensome audits for ordinary Americans?
I've issued a directive to the IRS that clearly prohibits them from using these funds to target individuals or small businesses making under $400,000. And let's be clear, the focus of this, there are really two focuses of this money that's been allocated. One is to greatly improve customer service, both for individuals and for businesses, modernizing the IRS. And the second is to address the tax gap. And the tax gap isn't related to individuals or small businesses making under $400,000 a year. It's wealthy, very high-income individuals, complex partnerships, and corporations that are, by and large, underreporting and underpaying their tax. And the money will go to hiring trained, experienced accountants and tax professionals who are able to do the complex audits that are necessary to recover those funds. So there would be no motivation to want to target taxpayers making under $400,000. And I have directed the IRS that they may not do so.
For 10 years now, I've been on this committee, and money has been given year after year to automate the processes at the IRS. And now you're saying that they need more manpower versus automation.
They need manpower and automation. And there will be, for example, of the resources in the budget for 2024, the lion's share will go toward technology and operations, some toward net increases in enforcement. That will take time, but there will be massive improvements over time in technology, and we will end up with a modern agency that people will have much better experience and companies interacting with.
I yield back.
Mr. Pocan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding this hearing. Appreciate it. And thanks to our witnesses. I'd like to try to get to two areas. So let me start first, kind of just talking about the economy, worried about the debt ceiling that we're facing. So we just talked a little bit about interest rates, and Moody's Analytics, they had an economist who predicted that we would have global market panic on the scale of the 2008 financial crisis, result in more than 7 million job loss, unemployment rate of over 8%, elimination of 10 trillion in household wealth, and decline in real GDP of more than 4%. So that means people are paying more for small business loans, for cars, for homes. But there's a second part that I'd like to ask Director Young specifically about, that a debt limit breach could disrupt expected payments to the military, veterans, and seniors, specifically 65 million Americans who receive Social Security and Medicare benefits, and 18 million veterans who could lose access to their benefits. That's 330,000 people in my state. Could you just briefly address that aspect of the debt ceiling?
Many of us have experienced shutdowns where people don't get paid until the government reopens, and this is not that. You've heard the Secretary of Treasury lay out the catastrophic economic fallout from a default and what means if we even get close to flirting with. But it also means those people who have payments, like our military, like our veterans, like our seniors who are on Social Security and Medicare, we will know the revenues we have as Treasury processes those. So we cannot guarantee what gets paid, and it will be a very chaotic situation where those who rely on the government for salaries and services, that is what default is. That means we cannot guarantee that they will receive their paychecks or the services in which many of them have paid into their entire lives.
No, thank you. I just think, back home, people don't talk about raising the debt limit. That's very Washington speak, but they talk about whether or not they get their Social Security check, their veterans benefit, whether interest rates are going to rise when they buy something. And I think those are the real ramifications that we should be talking about more as we do this. Second area, and this is, I'll admit, is a little bit out of left field, but I have a real concern where we're at right now with the Fed and raising of interest rates. And Secretary Yellen, this is specifically for you because I respect your opinion so much. I know you're not in charge of the Fed, but I do respect your opinion. So the normal business, the normal model, I guess, is if inflation is high, the Fed has kind of a singular blunt tool of raising interest rates until people lose jobs. I guess that's the best way of putting it in a blunt way. But I don't feel that this is the normal time that interest rates go up and that works. I feel like, and I'm a small business owner for 35 years, and I can tell you what I'm seeing right now. First of all, our offices, I'm guessing everyone has an unprecedented request for passports right now because people, after 3 years of not traveling, want to get out and go somewhere, and that's not going to be stopping. And in our business, we deal business to business, trade association, nonprofit. That's not stopping. They haven't had some of the events for the last 3 years. They're doing it no matter what happens. So demand isn't necessarily going down at the rate you'd expect, yet we are affecting the housing market. We're affecting banks right now. We're having a lot of negative effects by continuing to raise the interest rates, but it's not the normal model. I just don't feel like it from everything I'm seeing and experiencing from being on this planet for 58 years. So my question is, in your opinion, are we doing the right efforts? Corporate profits are way high. There's a lot of things that are askew as you look at the model that's happening. I feel like ultimately this could have some really negative recession-type ramifications and other ramifications, and I'm worried about continuing to raise interest rates.
So first, let me say, I don't want to comment on the Fed's interest rate decisions. I respect their independence. Well, I was over there myself and had to make these decisions. I wear a different hat now and don't want to comment on theirs. But I've long said I do believe there is a path by which we can maintain a strong labor market and also bring down inflation. And I believe that's the path that the Fed would ideally like to follow. The labor market at the moment is extremely tight. There are roughly 2 vacancies for every person looking for a job. And that pressure it's certainly not the only factor involved in inflation, but it's contributing to inflation, particularly in services. So while some inflation is coming down because of supply chain reasons and impact of Russia's war on Ukraine. The Fed is concerned that they need to relieve some of that pressure. That doesn't mean we have to have a recession. I would admit that it is a risk whenever monetary policy is being tightened, but I believe that there is a path that will bring it down without really damaging the labor market, and that's what I hope we will see.
I appreciate it. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Moolenaar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Yellen, Director Young, thanks for being here with us today. Secretary Yellen, on February 17th, over a month ago, I sent you a letter and asked you in your capacity as chair of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., CFIUS, to provide an update regarding large foreign investments in Michigan. Are you familiar with that letter? Okay.
Yes,
To
I
date,
am
I have
familiar
not
with your
received a
letter.
response. And my constituents want to know that you're reviewing investments that could pose a possible risk to our country and are doing it in a timely manner. When can I expect a response to my letter regarding a CFIUS review?
I apologize that we haven't responded and promise that we will do so quickly. But I do want you to know that in the work we do in chairing CFIUS, that we are very focused on evaluating foreign investments in the United States that can impose national security risks. I can't speak to whether particular transactions are or are not being reviewed by CFIUS. That's subject to strict confidentiality. But the issues that you raise in your letter are ones that CFIUS takes very seriously and is attentive to.
Okay, so I understand you don't want to comment on specific situations, but can you comment on what, in your view, would constitute a risk? If a China-based company has CCP members on their boards, do you believe that company with CCP members on its board constitutes a risk in the United States if it's located here?
So I don't want to make a blanket assertion about that. It certainly could. But what CFIUS does is a thorough and detailed analysis of whether or not the investment is in areas or involves technologies or things that would involve a national security risk.
Okay, would a company investing in the United States, if it has in its articles of association a requirement for the company to set up a CCP organization and carry out party activities in accordance with the Constitution of the CCP, would you see that as a risk to the United States?
Well, it certainly could be a risk. I think I would need to know a little bit more about what the activity is and what the investment is, but certainly that is something that could certainly constitute.
And if a company was requiring Americans to adhere to the principles of a hostile foreign government, would that constitute a risk?
Well, I think we would need to know exactly what the business is of the company and how it impacts national security, because the focus of CFIUS is really on national security, so we would have to take these concerns to national security.
And if a foreign company requires its subsidiaries to promote influence and intelligence operations by foreign governments within the U.S., would that constitute a risk?
Well, that certainly seems to go directly to national security.
Okay. How, as the committee with responsibility for oversight, what you're telling me is this is a very important matter.
Absolutely.
But we don't have the information on how many CFIUS reviews are being conducted, which priority projects are being looked at. When communities or states are looking at different projects, how do they know how to make their decision? You'd said earlier how transparency is very important in making decisions, and I agree with that. What guidelines do you have for communication on this?
I can have my staff get back to you and give you more detail on this, and they may be able to offer briefings without going into details about specifics that could be helpful.
And I think it's simply because, you know, and I noticed and I appreciated your comments about Russia, the situation in Ukraine. You mentioned China recently. Obviously, there's a, you know, new select committee on China. I happen to be part of that, as others do. And you know, in looking at that, we want to make sure we consider the threats posed by the CCP. And obviously, they're doing a lot of investments in the United States. And you're on point for this with the CFIUS reviews.
These investments get very detailed analysis and serious review. And it is a very thorough process and taken very seriously to try to identify national security risks. I would ask my staff to give you more details on
Thank you.
this, but
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Bishop?
Thank you very much. Let me welcome our two witnesses, Secretary Yellen, Director Young. The President's budget invests in America, lowering costs, strengthening Social Security, Medicare, and attacking the deficit. On the other hand, the proposed unprecedented cuts in FY '24 to FY '22 levels that the Republicans have offered seems to have a tremendous effect on education, public safety research, and nutrition. Would this have a real damaging effect on our families, communities, the economy, and competitiveness? Treasury provides some critical services that American people rely on every day. Payments, tax refunds, taxpayer assistance. It appears to me that if we go back to 22 levels, it would be devastating to the American people. Treasury is responsible for revenue collection, financial management, borrowing, and debt collection for the entire government, and promoting international economic stability. You protect the integrity of our financial system, and you combat global financial crime and corruption. And of course, it would appear that going back to 22 levels would certainly impair your ability to monitor risks to ensure an effective and unified approach to promoting financial stability as we're faced with right now. Our national security would appear to be impacted, and either of you can comment on this. The Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence would be jeopardized, our national security would be jeopardized because you wouldn't be able to enforce sanctions, including the sanctions targeting Russia. When we are supporting Ukraine, this would appear to send the wrong message to Mr. Putin. So it seems like your ability to carry out your functions would be tremendously limited. And of course, looking here domestically, you have the responsibility for community development financial institutions, grants and assistance. And of course, if you have to cut that back, it means that many of America's most economically disadvantaged communities would be hurt because there would be fewer resources for small business lending, affordable housing, and consumer products and services to help with our economic development and job growth. It just seems as if all of this is a big, big problem and a step backwards. Can the two of you comment on what that really means for the American people? What the Republicans are trying to do by going back from the proposed increases that the president has offered to the 2022 levels?
well, you've given an excellent list of ways in which Treasury programs would be impacted. The Internal Revenue Service, you would see, we now are operating with an 85% level of customer service it would revert to the abysmal levels we had before funding was increased. And the money that's allocated to the Inflation Reduction Act for modernization of the agency would have to go for the basics of processing returns. As you said, cuts for the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence would compromise our ability to put in place sanctions. Cuts to FinCEN would mean we were less able to combat corruption and money laundering globally. Cuts to the CDFI fund would mean we're less able to support disadvantaged communities and financing there. And really, these are all important ways in which
Would you say
Treasury will
that,
be
that,
affected.
that to do that would really be to fly in the face of common sense and the protection of the American people?
Yes, absolutely. And with respect to the IRS, it would be deficit increasing, not deficit reducing, because the money that we provide to the IRS has a great impact on its ability to collect taxes, and so it would be a false economy.
I think my time has expired.
Ms. Hinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, ladies. Secretary Yellen, thank you for coming before our committee today. It's nice to meet you in person and get the opportunity to ask you some questions. And Shalanda, Madam Director, thank you. It's great to talk to you. It was great to have a conversation yesterday as well. I really appreciate your time in answering some of my questions yesterday before the committee hearing. So what I want to start with is, Secretary Yellen, I want to follow up a little bit on your comments that my colleague was kind of asking about CFIUS specific to national security. Obviously, with Treasury's role in making sure we're taking a better look at transactions and foreign investments, specifically the foreign investments by entities like the Chinese Communist Party. I'm also on the Select Committee on Competition with China. So we're working to, of course, combat their efforts to gain control over critical areas of our society. It's never been more vital in my mind to conduct that critical oversight of our foreign investments that do risk our national security. And so a hot topic on the Hill today, I want to touch on TikTok, because for the past several years, TikTok has been negotiating a national security agreement contract with CFIUS in response to the criticisms that the app is putting American data at risk. But earlier today, we learned that TikTok had published a video. There was a video of a date of an Energy and Commerce hearing before it was publicly noticed. And this video, I have a clip here, but it was inciting violence against members. And I seek unanimous consent to enter this reporting into the record, if I may, sir.
Any objection? Without objection.
But I see this as directly threatening, and this is something that this platform, enabled by the Chinese Communist Party, has enabled. So I believe the time to act, frankly, was yesterday here. And additionally, the Treasury Department issued a statement just today that CFIUS will not clear any transaction unless it determines that there are no unresolved national security concerns. So will you commit to us today that if CFIUS is aware of any outstanding unresolved national security concerns, that a TikTok transaction will not be cleared?
So I regret that I cannot talk about an individual transaction, even to indicate whether or not CFIUS is looking at it. There are strict confidentiality obligations. But on the more general point, absolutely, CFIUS looks very carefully at these transactions and will not clear a transaction if there are national security concerns. And when it comes to data, we're seeing an increasing number of cases that do present risks around this issue of the type that have been mentioned in connection with
Well, and obviously,
TikTok.
time is of the essence here, right? We talk about this post that lived online for over 40 days. It's taken years to get to a place where we have a decision. So why is it taking so long? I mean, we're
There's-
at 3 years now.
There's ongoing litigation over TikTok that is not yet resolved.
So if that litigation is playing out and if you have legitimate concerns about national security, is there any tool that you can use to put a stop to this? Is there any tool that you have in your toolbox?
I mean, yes, there are tools that are in the toolbox.
What would you use then? I mean, while this litigation is ongoing, what mechanisms could you turn to help protect the American people in this case against a Chinese Communist Party enabled platform?
So I'm sorry, I really can't talk about the details of this case, but there
Can you talk about it in generalities in terms of the tools that you might use? If maybe let's take TikTok's name off of it. If it is in general a threatening entity, what would be the tools that you would use?
requirements that the business of the company be structured in the United States in a way that protects national security.
While we're on the subject of national security, I'll move on, but what is the department doing to make sure that its core services are protected from cyber attacks? Cyber hygiene is obviously a very crucial part of protecting Americans' information. What is the agency doing to make sure that you are hardened?
So we are greatly enhancing our cybersecurity investments. We've requested increases to be able to do that, especially given the role that the department plays in imposing sanctions. We are a target of a serious number of cyber attacks, and we are investing very heavily in cybersecurity to meet very high standards.
All right, thank you, Madam Secretary. I yield back.
Mr. Cartwright.
Chairman Womack, Ranking Member Hoyer, thank you for holding this important hearing. And Secretary Yellen, thank you for coming, and Director Young, you as well. Director Young, my question is for you. It was January 1, 2006 that Medicare Part D came into play. That's when it started to be used in this country, and it meant that pharmaceuticals were provided to seniors on Medicare, but it came with a gimmick, and the gimmick was that Medicare was not able to use its purchasing power. Medicare was not able to talk price. Medicare was not able to negotiate with drug companies as it bought its supply for the seniors who depended on it. And you tell people that, wait a minute, why couldn't Medicare negotiate with drug companies? And the answer is it was part of American law. We made that part of American law here before 2006. People have a hard time believing that that happened. But with the Inflation Reduction Act, Congress has begun to break that log jam. Certainly it is a limited formulary being the $50 word, which means a list of medications. It's a limited formulary to start with, but Medicare has now been authorized to negotiate prices for some of these drugs. And we've seen the effect. We've seen the effect of insulin prices coming crashing down, and all of the people who depend on insulin, you know that they appreciate that. My question for you, Director Young, is what next steps do you think are necessary, and what more can we do to lower drug prices for seniors in this country?
You've laid out what the Inflation Reduction Act does. I don't need to repeat that, but you're absolutely right. That law began to change the government's ability to negotiate drug prices. I don't need to tell all of you what this country pays for drugs is vastly higher than other economies around the world. You just have to ask yourself why that is. In this budget, we go further than the Inflation Reduction Act, where more drugs will be brought into negotiation. The time frame would be about for it. it not only reduces money for seniors, the government would save $160 billion by doing more drugs in negotiation and bringing that forward. In addition, $40 more billion would be saved for taxpayers by instituting the inflation rebate, meaning drug company, if you are raising your drug more than inflation, you have to pay the American taxpayer back. And it's really using the purchasing power of Medicare to do two things: bring down costs for seniors and taxpayers, and extend the life of Medicare. That is part of our proposal to help the insolvency issue with Medicare.
Thank you for that. Of course, we had a State of the Union address not too long ago, and the president could not have made it clearer his commitment to ensuring the benefits provided by Social Security and Medicare. There have been voices, not everyone's voice, but there have been voices that are calling for cuts for those programs, for those insurance programs. And my question for you is, how can Congress work to reject any efforts to cut Medicare and Social Security benefits that people paid into their whole work lives and that people depend on in their seniority and in times of disability?
Look, I work for the President of the United States, who's made clear that he will oppose any reductions to benefits in both the Social Security and Medicare programs. He believes, as I mentioned in my opening statement, these aren't just programs, they are promises to generations of America's seniors, like my 94-and-a-half-year-old grandmother, that all of the money they have put into the system should be available to them, and their government promised that to them, and this president will keep that promise.
Well, I thank you both for appearing this afternoon, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Carl.
Oh, thank you, Secretary Yellen and Director Young. Thank you for being here and being able to speak in front of the committee. I'd like to make a quick statement here, though. I have not heard one single member in the Republican Party say anything about cutting Medicare and social benefits here. So I think that's a falsehood that's being brought up and spun for political purposes. With that said, Secretary, in regards to the bailout of the Silicon Valley Bank and the Signature Bank, I want to ask you a couple of questions. I talk to local bankers. I try to stay in tune with them. And they tell me that the problem of this bank being upside down, for lack of better words, should have been caught by the board review on the call report 1231. Was it? Was it flagged?
Well, I'm not responsible for supervision of these banks. So that's a question that should be addressed to the appropriate banking regulators.
But how about the government overseeing of these committees? Did anyone catch it? Did anyone review it?
Well, this is not the job of Treasury to be overseeing the regulatory agencies, either the Federal Reserve or the FDIC.
Okay.
They
all right.
have supervisory authority here.
Okay, so I watched I watched quite a few videos on you last night and read a lot, so very impressive, thank you. I watched your question from Senator Langford from last week, I believe it was. And again, it seemed the administration is putting itself in a position to pick the winners and the losers in our business community, and that bothers me. I've been in business for myself for close to 40 years, various businesses, and the biggest problem I always had, especially in the healthcare field, was the government itself getting in the way. So I'm always very sensitive to that. I developed my opinion about this from a statement that you made, and it said that the board would have to have a supermajority vote to cover 100% of the investors in other banks in the future, like you're doing in the Silicon Valley Bank?
Well, let me be clear in what I said.
Okay.
In the case of the two banks that were put into resolution, Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, we invoked a so-called systemic risk exception. And we did that because we determined, and when I say we, I mean supermajorities of the FDIC. Actually, the vote was unanimous. The FDIC board, the Federal Reserve Board, and myself, after consulting with the president, we felt that the failure to protect uninsured depositors would create contagion, and that there was a risk of runs on many banks that would not only undermine the security of depositors, but also compromise the ability of the American banking system to meet the credit needs of our country, of households and businesses. So we took this step. The Federal Reserve also took a step to create a facility that would improve access to liquidity for banks that are faced with deposit runs. I believe our tools worked, and what I've said is that these are tools we could use again for an institution of any size if we judge that its failure would pose a
With all due
contagion
respect,
threat.
I'm running out of time, and I've got 6 more questions here I know I won't get to, so I apologize for this. But you know, my question is simple with this short time I've got left. I'm glad to see that you brought the community banks and the small banks into the conversation, because they were really feeling like they were being fed to the wolves, for lack of better terms, and the big banks were taking over the conversation. So the small bank, and I appreciate you doing that. And that was something I pulled from that conversation last night. But let me ask you a question. If a small rural community bank in Alabama that invests into our rich coal mine communities and/or our oil drilling in the Gulf of Mexico investments, or doesn't adhere to the policies of the ESG, the political left-wing policies that are being pushed on, do you think they would get 100% bailout too?
Really, this has nothing to do with the particular business of the bank in question. It really is a judgment about whether or not the failure of the bank and the losses imposed on uninsured depositors threaten contagion that could undermine the broader banking system.
And I'm out of time. Thank you, ma'am. I disagree with you. I think a lot of the voters disagree with you too, but thank you for your time, and yield back.
Mr. Ciscomani.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Secretary Yellen, thank you for being here. Director Young, nice to meet you both. I appreciate your time. And thank you for coming before the committee to testify today. The state of our economy is one of the most important challenges that we're facing here in Congress and everywhere I go, especially in District 6 that I know well. I'm worried about the rampant inflation, unchecked government spending, and our national debt as well. And as we've seen in the past few weeks, information is spreading at a very quicker pace than ever before, a much quicker pace than ever before. And stability is needed in that. Now, Secretary Yellen, I'd like to follow up on some of the questions here by my colleagues regarding the recent bank failures. So I have just a series of short questions, and maybe you can just help me answer as many of them as we can get to in this short period of time. But have you determined whether a special assessment will be needed to replenish the FDIC's deposit insurance fund?
If there are losses, then a special assessment would be needed. It's not clear yet. I believe the FDIC, as a preliminary matter, assessed that there would be a $2.5 billion loss in the case of Signature, but that's not a final determination.
And also to follow up on the question regarding, thank you for that, on the regional banks or community banks, for example, in Arizona, will Arizona community banks be on the hook for this special assessment?
It would be determined by the FDIC's formulas and decisions.
So I'm sorry, is that a yes?
I
or
think
no?
it's a yes.
It's a yes, okay. And you've stated the Treasury Exchange, the Treasury's Exchange Stabilization Fund may serve as a backstop. How much money is there currently in the fund?
Including SDR, I believe there's about $200 billion in the fund.
And the funding is depleted in that fund, would taxpayers be on the hook to replenish it?
No.
And do you believe that the Fed's decision to raise interest rates will result in additional bank runs?
I'm not going to discuss the Fed's decisions on interest rates.
How do you think that would impact this subject in the conversation, the raising of the interest rates?
The Fed is addressing a significant inflation problem, making decisions that, in its independent judgment, are best. Also, I know, taking account of financial stability concerns, and I'm not going to comment on their decisions.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I think Mr. Cloud is on his way back, and we'll get to Mr. Cloud when he returns. So we're going to move into round two of our Q&A with the witnesses, and I'll lead. Director Young, I'm going to put my budget hat back on. I can't help but do that. And I want to talk about improper payments. And frankly, it's a subject that causes me to scratch my head. It is reported by the GAO that federal agencies dispersed an estimated $281 billion in improper payments in FY21, with cumulative improper payments totaling $2.2 trillion over the past 20 years. Let's repeat that. $2.2 trillion in improper payments. Now, what's always kind of been a mystery to me is if we know we've paid it and we know it's improper, how do we continue to live with that reality? So, Director Young, help me understand how OMB is focused on reducing improper payments. And I've just given you some numbers, so if I am off base, if I'm out of bounds on the subject, let me know. But I remember when we were doing, as budget chair, when we were doing the FY19 budget, obviously reducing improper payments was a critical component of us getting to achievable balance. So help me understand this improper payment phenomenon.
Look, I think this is a place we can find commonality in wanting to find solutions. Not to, with the secretary here, not to speak in her stead here, but one thing, and I've talked to Senator Kennedy from Louisiana about this, who's interested in making sure that Treasury has access to the Social Security death data to make sure that we are paying living human beings. That seems common sense to us, and we have taken steps to make sure that that happens. Unemployment insurance is, I believe, especially during the pandemic, the poster child for having this conversation. The budget has a proposal that would give us more tools to go after. Look, we saw criminal syndicates taking advantage of programs that American citizens needed during the pandemic. We should lock arms, in my opinion, and come together and make sure they cannot take advantage. Part of the problem in unemployment insurance is there's 50 different systems. Each state runs their own system, which means it is hard to stabilize those systems from a federal level because each state are in different places. We've got to do something about that, and I hope we can work together on going after fraud, especially in the unemployment system. And we have a proposal to do this, and I'm happy to work with anyone to go after this, because these programs need to be there for hardworking Americans who need this stopgap between jobs and should not be taken advantage by fraudsters and, frankly, big criminal organizations who have just gotten very good at gaming the system.
Do we not have the proper controls in place to prevent it?
Not currently. And part of the problem, as I said, is this very bifurcated state-led system. It is a federal-funded program run by the states, and we've got to do a better job of just getting in the weeds with each state, meeting them where they are, but it has got to improve.
Yeah, well, people that have testified in this hearing today, including my friend Steny, have indicated, and I agree, that we all want people to pay their fair share. And nobody should be asked to pay really more than their fair share. But I think the American public would be just as concerned if not more concerned, with the alarming rate of improper payments coming out of the federal treasury and going to people who should not be collecting that money. Would you not agree with that?
Yeah, and that is
I mean,
exactly.
it's outrageous.
Yeah, that is exactly why we ever posed. Look, it shows that an investment in doing away with the fraud that you talked about has a return on investment of 10 to 1. Why wouldn't we do that? And I think there is a place for commonality as we work through what's going to be a very complex budget and appropriation season. So I look forward to working with you on that.
Last question is regarding the federal workforce, and maybe we can just take this for record and get back to me on it, but increase in the federal workforce by 82,000 people, 3.6%. A lot of these people are working from home. I'll submit a question for the record on this because I am curious as to how we are justifying the work from home piece and not reducing our footprint, if you will, from a facilities point of view, but we'll submit that for the record later. And I'll yield my 6 seconds to the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Hoyer.
Thank you for your generosity. Let me ask you a question to follow up on the chairman's question. We'll agree. Fraud on the federal government that undermines the ability of the federal government to help people who are in need legitimately ought to be ferreted out and prosecuted, period. Madam Secretary, I want to ask you a question. I've talked to the chair about it. It bugs us both. I hear advertisements all the time on TV about people who, for whatever reasons, didn't pay their taxes. And this company is going to make sure that they cut their taxes in half or in third or a quarter. Now, if I'm listening to that ad and I haven't paid my taxes or am about to pay them, I don't have them, whatever, that encourages me not to pay them and get a better deal. It's not really a question, but you ought to look at that. I'm going to ask the IRS commissioner the same question because it's as if you really don't have to pay your taxes and we'll get you a deal. Whether you're making $4 or $4 billion, we'll make you a deal. And I think that undermines the voluntary compliance, which the U.S. has been very high on. Let me go back, and you don't need to answer that question, but it is a concern. Madam Director, you mentioned a figure in terms of getting rid of fraud and what the return is on enforcement. What's the return on money in enforcement in IRS?
I think the Secretary has spoken to this. What the Inflation Reduction Act did, if that is rescinded, the CBO has made clear that that will add to the deficit to the tune of about $100 billion because they will estimate, as much all budget scorekeepers will, that will bring in less to close this tax gap. So we will lose money for the Treasury.
The figure I recall from my previous life was about 7, 8, 9 to 1 return on the investment in enforcement. You get $7 or $8 or $9 in return. If that's the case, then cutting that has that $100 billion consequence that you just referred to. Let me close with this. We won't have a third round. And this is not a question. But we talk about debt, and I'm very concerned about the debt, and I like to think that we are fiscally responsible. We need to be fiscally responsible. In the last Congress, we spent a lot of money as a result of the pandemic. Excuse me, the Congress before that, the 116th, with the signature of Donald Trump and the agreement of the Secretary of Treasury. Why? Because we had an extraordinary challenge. If it was not resolved, would have cost much more than the money we actually spent, notwithstanding the fact it was a large number. So I think we need to work together as we work together on the debt limit in the Trump administration, as we work together on meeting the pandemic in the Trump administration. We need to work together to get our country on a sound fiscal footing, while at the same time investing in making sure that our economy grows, is vibrant, which will also reduce the deficit. Now, lastly, this is not a question. None of these are questions. I'm pontificating. as it will come as a great shock to everybody in this committee, I have a passing interest in where the FBI is going to be located in the future. No. I knew that would shock the chairman. A new consolidated FBI headquarters remains among my top priorities. I remain concerned about the low weighting of the cost criteria as only 10%. If we're concerned about deficit, we got to be concerned about costs for what we buy. 10% being ascribed, this is not a question, is in my opinion not justifiable. The chairman can speak for himself, but we have conversations about that. In the 2016 House resolution authorizing this project, Congress made it clear that GSA should consider the total cost of the government of relocation, site preparation, and site acquisition. Congress has made clear that whatever pocket of money comes out of it should be counted as part of the cost of this site, whatever pocket it comes out of. I just make that observation. I don't want a response at this point in time, but I'll continue to express my concern on that case. And Mr. Chairman, you and I have discussed that. We'll continue to discuss it.
Mr. Chairman, if I could thank the ranking member for his passion on this, I appreciate it, and I will take it back.
I look forward to the conversation. Welcome back, Mr. Cloud. Your turn.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Secretary and Director, for being here today. Wanted to ask the Secretary some questions. First of all, and I know you could probably give us a 3-hour lecture on this and still have more to say about it, but if you could give us the 30 to 60-second version on how important is it that the U.S. remain the world reserve currency?
Well, I believe we derive significant benefit from the dollar serving as the reserve currency. It's an important way in which we lower the cost, the borrowing cost that the federal government pays on its outstanding debt. And I would say that in imposing sanctions and trying to address global problems like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the fact that the U.S. dollar is used so widely in transactions facilitates our ability to impose those sanctions.
Now, this week, Russia and China got together, and Russia has said they're going to start using the yuan to settle trade deals. Does this concern you? And they also said that this would help accelerate the process of establishing a multipolar world order, which of course would mean a weakened U.S. on the global stage.
Well, I certainly want to see the dollar remain as the world's reserve currency. And there is a motivation that Russia and China have to try to develop another system that avoids the use of the dollar. But this is something that's tremendously difficult to accomplish. And I have confidence that the dollar will remain the world's reserve currency for a long time to come, in spite of there being various efforts to create systems to get around it.
Now, in 2008, the U.S. National Intelligence Council said in a report they produced that there's an unprecedented shift in relative wealth and economic power from the West to the East now underway, and they expected it to continue, that our relative strength will decline. And they said it was because of this. They said the transfer of global wealth and the economic power is now underway. It's unprecedented in modern history. And they said it comes from two sources. We're sending oil and gas revenues overseas, and we're sending manufacturing overseas. Yet a number of the policies that this administration continues to embrace support ESG, which we've seen. You know, China's not following that. Russia's not following that. They continue to build coal plants. China and Russia are talking about building another pipeline. And yet we seem to just be hamstringing Western countries on the front when we were producing energy and oil and gas, petroleum products more responsibly, cleaner than anyone else. One of the things concerned about this, we talked to a number of banks. I realize most of this is the SEC pushing this, but from your standpoint, we have European countries trying to impose these regulations on U.S. banks. that work in their markets, and therefore the U.S. businesses that do companies in that. And from a diplomatic perspective, it would seem that regardless of where you are on the ESG front, for or against, from a diplomatic perspective, you would be standing up for U.S. banks and U.S. businesses against what any other country's regulators would be trying to enforce on that. Do you have diplomatic efforts underway, or what could be done to combat that?
Well, we do have frictions with various countries, including the European Union, when we have differences in our regulations when it comes to things like disclosure of climate-related risks. Ideally, we would have a common system globally. I think that would level the playing field and reduce the burdens on businesses of what they're forced to disclose. But countries are making significant efforts to address climate change now, which I regard as a good thing. And tensions arise when we go about doing that in different ways. But we
You
do
mentioned-
have
I'm sorry, I only have 20
conversations.
seconds left. I wanted to ask you one more question. You mentioned leveling the playing field. I would think we'd want the U.S. to be more competitive than other countries. Biden has his stated policy. He has said himself that he's trying to create a multipolar world. It's an objective he shares with Putin and Xi. Do you also share the goal of a multipolar world?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what it is you're driving at here, but
Well, monetary policy certainly affects global dynamics, and if the president's agenda is to help create a multipolar world, I'm wondering how our financial policies would affect that, and certainly the diplomatic efforts that you are incorporating with other countries.
well, I'm not going to comment on multipolar world because I'm not sure exactly what you're driving at there, but certainly we work with other countries in order to make sure that American businesses are treated fairly in international commerce.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Pocan,
I'm going to yield 20 seconds to the ranking member.
just 20 seconds?
22.
But let me make a comment. The entire effort of the 117th Congress to make sure that the America economy and the American democracy was the transcendent democracy and economy in the world. That was our whole objective, and I think if we confirm it, it will be achieved. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Yellen, I understand you're not going to speak for the Fed, but I'm going to ask the question in another way, that you as an economist, could it be that there is the economic conditions right now are substantially different than in the past, given we just came out of a 100-year pandemic where the nation was largely disrupted for about 3 full years before we're getting to where demand is incredibly resilient, and after 9 interest rate hikes, demand has not moved a whole lot, that as an economist, could that sort of set of conditions, once-in-a-year pandemic, be different enough that we should be looking perhaps at some other measures to reduce demand?
Look, I'm just going to say, of course, the pandemic was a very unique event. And in terms of its economic impact, we've really never seen anything like it before. It led to enormous shifts from services, goods and services, away from services toward goods, and then back again away from goods toward services. We saw enormous supply chain issues developed that contributed to inflation. Because of this shift toward goods, those are receding now, lowering inflation, but we have a shift back in the direction of services. Services are having a hard time re-employing a workforce in tight labor markets. This is extremely unique, and consumer spending is proven to be robust. But GDP growth has slowed. We had a very rapid recovery. It has slowed, and we're back at full employment again. And I think there's a chance here that what the Fed is doing will serve to bring down inflation while maintaining a strong labor
No, I
market.
appreciate it. Thank you. I just think sometimes, I know that's their only tool they have, but sometimes when your only tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I kind of feel like at this point, we need some other approaches, whether it be a windfall profits tax, because corporate profits are still soaring, some kind of limited price control, just something else. But thank you very much for that answer. Director Young, so here's the question. Before it was inferred that no one has ever in the life of Republicans talked about cutting Medicare or Social Security, even though my Senator Ron Johnson has recommended we put it on the chopping block every single year. At least that's one Republican. I have heard several Republicans this year said that we should raise the retirement age perhaps to 70. Now, to me, I think I would call that a cut. If it's not a direct cut, it's at least a bait and switch. But could you talk just a little bit about if we actually raise the retirement age to 70, how that would impact people who've paid into it, and whether or not it's fair to call that a cut or whatever we would exactly call that?
Look, and I'll be very simple. That is a cut to benefits in our estimation. I know there's some disagreement with that, but that is fewer years receiving benefits from Social Security after people, for 20 years of their career paid into a system, expected to start collecting Social Security at a certain age, and then the goalpost is moved. That is a benefit cut.
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot of people who work in the trades in particular in my district who I know quite well, who, at some point, even if we're living longer, your body isn't necessarily allowing you to still to lay brick or to be an iron worker, and just to raise that age would be certainly a bait and switch to those folks and have a negative effect, and I would call that a cut. So that's the only reason I wanted to put that out for clarification. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Moolenaar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Yellen, first of all, thank you for being willing to brief me at my office on the CFIUS review process and where things are. I appreciate that very much. Director Young, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. The Government Accountability Office reported that as of January 31st, 2023, there was $90 billion in the American Rescue Plan funding remaining that is unobligated. That's a huge sum of money. Unfortunately, we haven't received timely updates about available balances from this recent legislation. Can you confirm that number?
Sir, I'm sorry to hear you have not. We have sent up to Congress. I'll make sure this committee has the balances. I have it here. We'll put it in the record and make sure your office has it. I would say for COVID funding writ large, the bills in total, 98% is obligated. Of ARP specifically, 95%
But is
is obligated.
Is 90 billion the amount? 'Cause that's
I'll
the-
make sure that is the amount, but it sounds in the range.
Okay.
I want to be exact with you and
No, I
provide that
appreciate that.
information.
But the fact, would you agree that we're no longer in an emergency?
So if I can, I'll let you know where the majority of those funds are. And you're
well,
right,
no,
the
I'm
public
just-
health emergency is the administration, the president
Yeah.
is lifting that order May 11th.
So we no longer have a need for a rescue plan. Would you agree with that? I mean, the emergency is over. I mean, that's what those funds were intended for, right?
Mr. Moolenaar, I just want to make sure you know where the majority of funds remain unobligated. And of course, it is Congress's discretion if they want to go pull those funds back. The majority of those funds remain in pensions, which, as you know, it has a long outlay and it remains in veterans benefits. And there's some money in HHS that, after not receiving more money, we plan on using for next generation vaccines.
So what you're saying is you've already figured out how you want to spend it next time, rather than saying, we have an opportunity to pay down the debt. I mean, $90 billion would go a long ways to paying down some debt.
No, I said it is Congress's decision. I'm, as you know, very attuned to the Appropriations Committee's constitutional role here. What I'm saying, as you make those decisions, know that most of the money remains from pensions.
But unobligated based on an emergency that's no longer there, right?
Well, pension funding in ARP was always intended to spend out over a longer period of time. So you would be taking funding back that a lot of pensioners would depend on. Veterans care.
Well, let me ask you this.
Sure.
Through the appropriations process, you're the expert. couldn't we fund those pensions as part of the appropriations process like we normally do, rather than using emergency funding that's no longer for an emergency?
I will say typically multi-employer and pensions is not done by this committee, but I'm sure you all will weigh in. Look, we will provide the data and we will have a robust back and forth to see what makes sense here. I'm just simply pointing out that the majority of the money that remains was always intended to have a tail. And the question on resources for HHS is, do we want next generation vaccines for COVID?
Well, and I approve of the idea of going through the appropriations process. I'm on the Labor H subcommittee, and we can certainly look at that. But why would we tell the American people we need to spend $6 trillion of emergency funding in this last Congress, and then find out we're no longer in an emergency and we still are gonna spend that money? That to me seems like fraud itself.
Well, Mr. Moolenaar, I'll be just very candid. We asked Congress multiple times for additional funding for next generation vaccines and therapeutics. A lot of, as you know, immunocompromised people, current therapeutics do not work. We were told no by Congress. So what we are doing now is looking at the unobligated balances at HHS and going to focus on those things. Now, what won't happen are things like long-term research in long COVID, which we don't know a lot about. So we will have to relook at our priorities here.
Well, I trust you're very capable in this process, and that when you come and talk to our Appropriations Committee, you're someone who has tremendous credibility.
They told me no.
Well, I think it's a matter of, let's figure out what the top priorities. There's a lot that we spend that wouldn't be maybe as top a priority, and you might have to agree to cut back on some of that. But I just think taking the people's money that was based on an emergency, when there's no longer an emergency, and spending $90 billion seems irresponsible to me. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, Director Young, it was 80, we're coming up on the 87th anniversary of the Rural Electrification Act. 1936 it was. It was a time in our country when we had electricity. We had electricity in most places, but we didn't have electricity in some places, in the back roads, in the hollows, in the places off the beaten path. We did not have electricity, and these places were being left behind. We're kind of coming up on a similar thing right now. We have broadband internet access in most places in this country right now, but there are places being left behind. And in the IIJA, we legislated $45 billion to make sure this doesn't happen, that we follow the pattern of the Rural Electrification Act, and that rural places get broadband internet. And of course, the president requested an additional $400 million for the Reconnect program you're familiar with, which provides grants and loans to deploy broadband to unserved areas, especially tribal areas. What do you see as the most important things to be accomplished so that we can accelerate access to broadband internet in rural places?
Well, the bipartisan infrastructure law was a game changer, so thank you for that. We believe the shorthand, the ACP program at FCC will bring broadband to 15 million homes in this country. You're looking at a caution light, girl. I grew up in a town of less than 2,000 with a caution light, so I'm very aware of those communities who often don't have adequate attention from their federal government or state government. This is meant to change that, and you have my commitment. We've just started to implement this. If more needs to be done, we'll be right here making the case, working with Congress, because, you know, this is not a luxury. We saw children sitting in the parking lot of McDonald's during the pandemic. That should not happen in this country. It is a necessity for kids, teachers, parents to have high functioning internet, and it's no longer, it's like 20 years ago saying having a cell phone was a luxury. Now, most people consider it something they can't do without in life, I would suggest that internet is the same way.
Thank you for that. And now, there was a comment or question made in this room that seemed to imply that this administration is not doing everything that it could do to outcompete China, to counter China. And my question to you is that a correct narrative?
Well, look, let me be very clear. This president says it over and over again. His Made in America agenda, his manufacturing boom, bringing 800,000 jobs back, that is directly about making sure that the United States of America remains the world leader, not China. And this budget has several proposals I hope we can work with on a bipartisan basis. I know Mrs. Hinson has a interest in this, and Mr. Moolenaar is on the China subcommittee. We have a proposal that would put vast resources, $6 billion, into efforts like infrastructure across the globe. Look, China goes into these places, like the continent of Africa, throws a little here, a little there, has vast access to their resources. Where are we? And we have to make sure that the United States remains the beacon I know we are, and that we have presence in those places, and make sure we are investing responsibly through our Development Finance Corporation, through our Millennium Challenge Corporation, because if we aren't there, China will be there. So I certainly hope we can work together to implement these proposals.
Thank you, Madam Director, and I yield back, Mr.
Ms.
Chairman.
Hinson.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Some sobering statistics, numbers, $31.6 trillion in debt. That's about $94,000 per citizen, $246,000 per taxpayer. So I want to talk a little bit about what that cost looks like for Iowans. And so, Director Young, can you speak a little bit today to the rising interest costs, how that fits into these numbers as we're seeing the debt balloon? What are some of the tangible impacts to working families as a result of those rising interest costs?
Thank you for that. And we like to use public held debt, which is about $24 trillion. I believe you're using both debt points together, but either way, this is why this president put forward proposals that bring down the deficit, because we do also believe that our investments should be paid for. And if we don't go about investing tax cuts in a fiscally responsible way and pay for them, our deficit and debt problem will be worse, Congresswoman. And I know there's disagreement on how you do that, but this president has put forward tax reform that would save $3 trillion or nearly $3 trillion over 10 years.
I see this as a complete tax shift, but if you talk about rising costs and the impact that has, I think one of the quickest ways we could address that is energy, and I think we have different perspectives as well on lowering energy costs, but I've been advocating for that, and I would encourage you to continue to look at Iowa's biofuels as an answer, and please take that feedback back to the president. We need an answer on E15 if you can. I'd also like to ask and follow up on the CCP challenges that we're facing, since you referenced that again, and it's very clear that this committee has a very unified interest in that. Since you do have kind of an all-of-government look through OMB, do you have any recommendations on how we can better leverage our spending? You referenced that $6 billion number, but ways where we can truly counter the CCP's aggression through government.
So I mentioned two agencies in particular whose money can be used, the Budget Authority, the funding amount, but also they have the ability to finance projects. So their money goes a little further. So I'd love to have you talk to us about the Development Finance Corporation. They have some innovative ways of financing projects across the globe. Again, I mentioned the Millennium Challenge Corporation. They go in, sign compacts, and really try to leverage private dollars. So it's not just what we're investing here. What programs do we have that are leverage points that would attract private sector interest? And those two in particular are quite interesting in that way.
Are there any agencies engaged in related work to counter the CCP that you think could be doing a better job of collaborating and finding that either that outreach within the private sector or better outreach within government?
So those are two agencies. certainly, they will tell you they are resource constrained, which is one reason we put it here. And we have to, in order to attract private interest, they need to know the federal government is serious, is going to show up with resources. So that is what we're trying to do, have those programs be much more aggressive. And to do that, I look at this as capital, especially for DFC, to make sure that their finance tools can be put to use. You and I also talked about COFA, Compact for Free Associations, those tiny little places like Palau in the South Pacific. We need a presence there. We often talk about COFA in the Department of Interior. We put it under Department of State because we think it's a strong diplomatic tool to counter China and make sure we have a presence where we know they want to be.
Finally, I just want to talk a little bit about the regulatory burden and cost on farmers, small businesses, and families. What plans do you have in place to more appropriately account for the cost of regulations on people before they are actually implemented?
Yeah, so a part of OMB is the Office of Regulatory Affairs, and it is part of our duty. Our executive order that governs us, 12866, says we have to look at cost-benefit analysis for regulations. We are committed to continue that. We're not going to change that. What we are doing is looking to modernize. Far too many rules come into OIR that the amount of economically significant has not changed in, I believe, about 30 years. And we need to raise that so that fewer things come in for review. So we are modernizing, but what we are is committed to making sure we keep a robust cost-benefit analysis in the regulatory system.
Director Young, this is one of the number one issues I hear about from my constituents is the cost of the regulation on doing business, and we can truly unleash this economy if we take that into consideration and reduce that burden on our businesses and our taxpayers. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Cloud.
Thank you, Chair. I wasn't going to bring this up, but since it was mentioned, I wanted to go back to it. It's then Vice President Biden's own words. He said, "We are trying to build a multipolar world." Those aren't my words. That's not my interpretation. That's an exact quote. So is it your understanding that now he's joined the America First movement, or is this continues to be his policies, and do you endorse that?
If that's directed at me, I'm with Secretary Yellen. I tend not to answer things I don't fully understand in multipolar world. I'll leave it at that. What I do know, and what I've heard this president say, is that we have to regain footing in several ways. We have to, of course, maintain a strong defense. We have to do things in the diplomatic front, like the programs I talked about. But we also, what are we spending in research? China is growing their footprint in manufacturing and things we are far behind in. That is part of what the Inflation Reduction Act will change. We will build more of that clean energy here and bring jobs back here. So this president has been crystal clear that he believes America's role is to be first in those places, including
America
in
was already
research.
leading, in producing clean energy. We were the best at producing oil and gas. We're the best in what you would call green energy. We're leading the world in that, and so the Inflation Reduction Act was not necessary in reaching that goal. We were already leading the world in that. You said, let's not hold the debt ceiling hostage to really draconian cuts that all help the wealthiest in this country. And then Secretary Yellen, you said, I don't think that we should, you said, in speaking of prioritization in relation to the debt ceiling, you said that prioritization is simply not paying all the government's bills when they come due. That's something we've never done. It's really just default by another name. And I was kind of puzzled by that because, our job in Congress is to prioritize what the spending should be. The president submits a budget, and then we weigh it, and then we send it. And I'm a little puzzled to see that, some of the things we're spending money on, watching hamsters fight on steroids, turning mice into binge drinking alcohol, drag shows in Ecuador. The Biden administration is funneling tax dollars to Colombian LGBT groups that back prostitution. We have 77,000 empty federal buildings. One of the big things going on at the border is no bid contracting that's under investigation now. So there's a lot of areas it seems that we could cut that wouldn't be considered a default. Would you agree?
No, I wouldn't agree because it's certainly up to Congress and this committee to decide about the budget for 2024 and years after that, what future commitments Congress chooses to make about spending levels. But the debt ceiling is about paying bills for programs Congress already approved.
No, but there
and
are
has
some, there
undertaken.
are some, for example, the COVID funding that was mentioned, it's $90 billion, I think, of funding
Well, the
that's not being
bills that
used.
come to Treasury to pay cover expenses that Congress has authorized. And they've gotten to the point of services have been provided, whether it's by the federal government's own workforce or contractors who have bills to pay for workers that they've hired to provide government services, and it's about paying those bills when they come due. And if you don't pay bills that come due for services that you have ordered and
I think I get what you're
authorized,
saying, and I'm
that's
kind of
default.
running out of time here. If I could move on. One, as someone new on this committee, one of the things that I've been trying to go through numbers, me and my team and everything, that's been difficult is the things that I mentioned. One of the reasons I mentioned them is because most of them are not line items in a budget. They have to do with the grants and contracting, which is kind of opaque to us. Even it's very difficult to find. We send a top line in a budget. We'll appropriate dollars toward a budget, but then the grants it's really opaque to what's going on, and that's where a lot of the policy initiatives are, and really a lot of the nefarious action is going on. And I would wonder if you would work with us and help come up with some transparency mechanism to where not just us, but the American people can see not only what we are attempting to spend money on, but what the actual grants are going to, how they're being approved, where they're going. Because, one of the things, I mentioned training mice to binge drink, that's an NIH thing, while they were doing gain of function and everything else that we're looking into. If we could have had transparency on where these grants are going, it would have helped. Is that something that we could work with
So
you on?
let me include
Kind of
this.
the technicality of how to.
This subcommittee in particular certainly knows how to mandate transparency. OMB currently puts every single action that authorizes agencies to go out and execute on their appropriations. So you've heard a lot about apportionments, I'm sure. In the last administration, this committee in particular directed OMB to put every single last apportionment, which is transparency we've never seen the level of. So this committee is certainly led in transparency. I'll also point you to USA spending, which has obligation data. There is a lag, so people complain you don't see it real time. But the goal was, in past Congresses and administrations, it made sense to put those obligations online, and usaspending.gov does that. And I'll point out, just at NIH, peer review panels do pick those research grants, so I'm not sure about the ones you've mentioned, but I'm happy to go back and look at those. But, we just have to be very careful that we don't do anything to assert politics or into a peer review process as we select research grants.
I can appreciate that, but peer review is what gave us a lot of faulty information during COVID too, so we probably need to look at that as well.
Mr. Ciscomani, bring us home.
What a tall order.
Put the freshman to that task. That's great. Well, let me just actually close with a bit of a different topic, and let me touch on Iran real quick. Sanctions on Iran are a key component of the U.S. strategy to increase the pressure on the Iranian regime to abandon its ambitions for nuclear weapons and its support for terrorism and cease other illicit activities. Now, with nuclear negotiations not currently on the agenda and Iran's nuclear program continuing to expand, increasing the economic pressure on Iran is essential. Given nuclear negotiations seem to be at a standstill, is it fair to say that the administration's views maximum enforcement of sanctions as a key component of our Iran strategy?
The Treasury Department has leveled extremely tough, the toughest possible sanctions on Iran, and is enforcing those sanctions and constantly trying to identify ways in which they may be violated and taking further enforcement actions. So Iran is subject to exceptionally tough sanctions, and we look to strengthen them and continue to take actions to do so.
Now, on that, with all due respect on that, do you really think that Iran does feel the type of economic pressure that would be necessary to force the regime to change their policies? I don't get that sense, to be very honest with you, that they feel that pressure at the level that it would actually change their behavior significantly. So what do you think, or some examples that is happening in your opinion? And if we could be doing better, what are ways that we could increase the enforcement of our sanctions?
So my sense is that our sanctions on Iran have created a real economic crisis in the country, and Iran is greatly suffering economically because of the sanctions. I would say the same thing is true of North Korea. On the other hand, if you ask, has that forced a change in behavior? The answer is much less than we would ideally like.
So, okay, so let's close with that. What do you think would be the way to increase that, the enforcement on that, or be more forceful to get the result that we would want?
You know, we're constantly looking for ways to broaden the sanctions, to enable them to better accomplish our objectives. But sometimes a regime is so committed to a program that even when the population of that country is suffering immensely because of sanctions we've imposed, they continue to prioritize activities that are ones that we're trying to stop. And so my sense is that we need a broader toolkit, and do have a broader toolkit to use. You know, sanctions can play a role in changing behavior, but they may not be sufficient in that.
I agree with you on that, and I think it's troublesome that's a reality that we're seeing here. So I do encourage Treasurer to continue to look for the broader opportunities, as you mentioned, and be forceful on those approaches. Thank you.
Stenny, closing word?
I think all of us believe that we want to see America grow, be successful, and be preeminent. The bipolar world or the multipolar world is a reality. We used to have the Soviets and ourselves, and that was a bipolar world. It's now obvious that a number of nations have increased their economic abilities, particularly China. So the issue is, in my opinion, Mr. Chairman, whether we're going to continue to invest in America, in basic research, in manufacturing. I've had a Make It in America agenda for 13 years. This is all about making it in America, not only in terms of making it physically, but making it in success terms. So I'm hopeful, Mr. Chairman, that we can work together, as I said at the beginning, to achieve the objective that I think we all share, that America continues to be the greatest and best nation on earth, and plays a significant role in keeping a world, if not at peace, at least at bay.
Yeah, well stated, and I think that would get universal agreement around the table. To our witnesses, we promised we'd get you out of here in 2.5 hours, and in one piece, and we've met the objective. So thank you, Madam Secretary, Director Young, thank you for your testimony here this morning, well received. To my colleagues, thank you. If you have questions for the record, you have 7 days to get those to the relevant subcommittee staff so that we can get those to the relevant agencies. And if there are no further comments, then this subcommittee hearing is adjourned. Thank you.
I get